Elizabeth has just finished reflecting on how A, the Bennets are doing a stupendous job humiliating her and Jane, and B, how Mr. Darcy and the sisters of Mr. Bingley are taking serious note of how poorly their family is conducting themselves. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail with her to dance with him again, put it out of her power to dance with others. In vain did she entreat him to stand up with somebody else, and offer to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He assured her that, as to dancing, he was perfectly indifferent to it, that his chief object was by delicate attentions to recommend himself to her, and that he should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed her greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them, and good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins's conversation to herself. So poor Elizabeth, she can't get rid of Mr. Collins, he can't get her to dance with him again, and she can't get him to dance with someone else. He says his main goal this evening is to flatter her and pay her all the attention in the room, and she can't get him to leave. Thank goodness for Charlotte Lucas, who comes, sits with them, and often talks to Mr. Collins, taking some of the pressure off of Elizabeth. She was at least free from the offense of Mr. Darcy's further notice. Though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged, he never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be the probable consequence of her allusions to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. At least Mr. Darcy doesn't come over and talk to Elizabeth again. She thinks she's probably kept him away by mentioning Wickham. The Longbourn Party were the last of all the company to depart, and, by a maneuver of Mrs. Bennet, had to wait for their carriage a quarter of an hour after everybody else was gone, which gave them time to see how heartily they were wished away by some of the family. Mrs. Hurst and her sister scarcely opened their mouths, except to complain of fatigue, and were evidently impatient to have the house to themselves. They repulsed every attempt of Mrs. Bennet at conversation, and by so doing threw a languor over the whole party, which was very little relieved by the long speeches of Mr. Collins, who was complimenting Mr. Bingley and his sisters on the elegance of their entertainment, and the hospitality and politeness which had marked their behaviour to their guests. Darcy said nothing at all. Mr. Bennet, in equal silence, was enjoying the scene. Mr. Bingley and Jane were standing together, a little detached from the rest, and talked only to each other. Elizabeth preserved as steady a silence as either Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley, and even Lydia was too much fatigued to utter more than the occasional exclamation of, "Lord, how tired I am," accompanied by a violent yawn. So after the party ends, Mrs. Bennet somehow figures out how to make the carriage be 15 minutes late, so they have to stay there. It doesn't really work in her favor because Miss Bingley's are just saying how tired they are and basically, suggesting how unwelcome the Bennets are. They've really overstayed their welcome this evening. When at length they arose to take leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil in her hope of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressed herself particularly to Mr. Bingley, to assure him how happy he would make them by eating a family dinner with them at any time, without the ceremony of a formal invitation. Bingley was all grateful pleasure, and he readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her, after his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a short time. So Mrs. Bennet invites Mr. Bingley over to dinner. He says that would be wonderful. I just have to go to London tomorrow, but when I'm back, definitely. Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied, and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that, allowing for the necessary preparations of settlements, new carriages, and wedding clothes, she should undoubtedly see her daughter settled at Netherfield in the course of 3 or 4 months. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins, she thought with equal certainty, and with considerable, though not equal pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children, and though the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. So again, Mrs. Bennet is really excited. She's got a 4-month timeline until Jane and Bingley get married, and she's excited because she thinks Elizabeth, her least favorite daughter, is going to get married to Mr. Collins, and that'll be great. 2 daughters married, check, check. Mrs. Bennet's life goal looks like it's going to be well on its way to completion. And that is chapter 18.